So we just want to start at the very beginning. What was your birth name?
Oh, well, my mother had 3 kids, one of each. Oh, God. No, my birth name was Andre Kahn, K-A-H-N.
And what year were you born?
And I was born in 1945.
Where?
In Brooklyn, New York.
Okay. Can you tell us a little bit about what you remember from your childhood years in Brooklyn?
Well, I came from a very musical family. My father was a musician, so was his brother and his sister. What do I remember from my childhood? I remember we were like the first family on the block or in the building to have a TV. When I was like 4 or 5 years old, like in 1949, 1950. And I was just glued in front of the TV. Milton Berle, Howdy Doody, that kind of stuff, cartoons.
And they've all clearly left their mark on your sense of humor.
Exactly. Three Stooges.
Whereabouts in Brooklyn?
In East Flatbush, Brownsville.
How would you describe the neighborhood?
When I was growing up, it was 100% Jewish. And then by the time I was a teenager, the Puerto Ricans were moving in.
And was that a shift that you remember the people in the neighborhood were feeling as a new thing?
Well, it was the beginning of the way all cities were changing. You know, the middle class was moving out to the suburbs. The white people were moving away. All the Jews were moving to Florida and Long Island. And it's funny though, when I went back, like in the year 2000 with my son, it looked exactly the same.
So there weren't any moments of overlap where the Jews and the Puerto Ricans were living?
Yeah, there were. Like when I went to junior high school, because the way the zoning for the school was, half the kids from one neighborhood went to that school, and from the Puerto Rican neighborhood went to that school, and then from the Jewish neighborhood, so we all met at junior high school. But there was never a racial problem or nothing like that.
You grew up in a Jewish family. What did that mean for you? What, like, in terms of the Khans as Jews?
Well, we lived next door to my mother's parents, my grandmother and grandfather on my mother's side. They were kosher. My grandfather was I wouldn't say Orthodox, but they went to temple a lot, and you know, my grandfather would do the Passover Seder, and they should light candles on Friday night, and they only spoke Yiddish. My grandmother was in this country for 60 years. She never spoke English.
And did you grow up speaking any Yiddish yourself?
No, I learned to understand it because when my grandparents didn't want me to know about something, they were talking Yiddish. And my grandmother would listen to WEVD all day long, to the Yiddish shows. She didn't have to speak English because all the shopkeepers spoke Yiddish, and all the neighbors spoke Yiddish, and they were from the Ukraine.
And was that an issue for you as a kid? Like, did you want to actually understand Yiddish? Or were you happy not to speak it and speak English?
It didn't bother me, and at the same, even the other day I was talking about this, and we never bothered to ask our grandparents, like, why do you speak like that, and where are you from, and never bothered to ask them. This is a funny story though, that my grandmother, because she didn't speak English, her favorite show on TV was wrestling. Because she didn't have to understand the English. She would sit in front of the TV. This was in the early 50s. And like the bad guys were the Russians and the German wrestlers and the Japanese wrestlers. And she would curse at them in Yiddish and watch TV, you know. Or, you know, Baron von Raschke and Killer Nikita Koloff, all those, that kind of stuff. And to this day, that's one thing that I'm still a big wrestling fan too.
And so was your sense when you were young that you guys were growing up as Americans in Brooklyn, or did you have a sense of yourselves as Jews, as something that was different?
Well, everybody we knew was Jewish. Yeah, I sort of remember like the first Puerto Rican kid in the 2nd grade who came into the class. He was the son of the super. You know, the superintendent of the building, or the janitor, whatever it was. It never really entered my mind that much until I started to go into to Hebrew school. when I was like around 10 or something.
And how did that change your sense of?
Well, because your parents told you, you can't play outside after school, you got to go to Hebrew school now. You can't go to the playground and you got to start learning Hebrew, and what is that? They're kind of serious about it, and in those days the Hebrew teachers were serious about it too. It's not like when my kids were bar mitzvahs. They had like ultra reformed bar mitzvahs.
And now, what had you started playing music yet by the time you were going to Hebrew school, or no?
Oh yeah, I was taking piano lessons from the time I was about 5 or 6.
Was that something that was a kind of family decision or something you wanted to do?
I guess a little of both. My brother was already playing piano, Like I said, we were a musical family, so between practicing for the piano and then going to Hebrew school Monday to Thursday, that's how it was. But then TV time.
Right. And well, you said you grew up in a very musical home. What kind of music was being played?
My father used to listen to mainly show tunes, and my father was a bass player and a singer. Show tunes and Broadway stuff, but his sister, my aunt, she would come over and play the piano and sing like Bamir Bista Shane and Yiddish songs, Idelsohn songs and stuff like that. My father's father, even though I never knew him because he died before I was born, was involved with the Yiddish theater. My father used to tell me that.
As an actor.
I was told that he translated Shakespeare into Yiddish.
And so you've got all this, you've got Yiddish music in the household, you've got grandparents speaking Yiddish. Like, what's the stuff you were listening to as a young kid? What was the music that was kind of sparking you?
Well, in the mid-1950s, automatically I liked black rock and roll. Chuck Berry, Little Richard, Fats Domino, and Elvis too, but I always liked, and my father took me to all those early Alan Freed rock and roll shows when I was like 9, 10 years old, because he was a musician and he knew all those guys. So we used to get us in, and he was friends with all those early black, I don't know if you want to call them R&B musicians or swing jazz musicians, but because he worked at the Latin Quarter in New York, and he used to hang out around the corner at this place called the Copper Rail with, later on when I was a teenager, I used to go to work with my father, and he would introduce me to like Coleman Hawkins and Philly Joe Jones, and he knew all those guys. Hank Jones and Erskine Hawkins and Sammy Man Taylor. And those are his drinking buddies.
Right. What kind of gigs did he play? He played as a kind of a sideman, or did he let his own bands?
No, my father started out as a tap dancer in vaudeville, and then after that, during the Depression, he became a bass player, and he's had a trio with my uncle who played the violin, and they had a third guy who played the accordion, and they sang in 3-part harmonies, and they would like travel all over the country for the William Morris Agency, like playing in between Benny Goodman and the Dorsey Brothers, and they were on the road constantly. And all through World War II, the same thing. They never stopped working. And then right after World War II, my father gets this gig at the Latin Quarter on Broadway as the leader of the dance band. They had the show band and the dance band. And he stayed there until 1962, until I was like 17 years old. And it was like the greatest gig in the world because it was a real easy gig, made a lot of bread, all these gorgeous showgirls hanging around. And the best part was like, while the show was on for 2 hours, he was downstairs in the bar drinking with his buddies. So it was, as a matter of fact, my brother's bar mitzvah was at the Latin Quarter, and Joey Bishop was the headliner. That was in 1952.
Okay. So here's your dad, son of Ukrainian immigrants, right? No.
That was my mother. My father was the son of, they're from Leipzig, Austrian German immigrants, okay. Jewish immigrants.
And they also spoke Yiddish?
Yeah, my father, you have to understand, they were the German Jews, and they were like a little bit on the snobby side. they didn't like the Polish and the Russian, the Lower East Side Jews, from the peasant Jews. As a matter of fact, the story goes that, like in 1933-34, some of my father's cousins and uncles came over from Germany, and they didn't like it on the Lower East Side of New York. And they went back to Germany, and that was the last they ever heard of them.
Wow.
So, no, because you know that the German Jews were more educated, they went to college, they were professionals, as compared to my mother's side. They were peasants from the UK, they were farmers. They came from the shtetls.
And so now in Brooklyn, your father basically he falls in with black musicians, jazz, rock and roll. What do you think? And obviously this was not a singular story. This was a fairly common story, especially for Jews in New York, to fall in love with black music. What do you think from,
And Latin music too.
And Latin music. What were the attractions of those musics for the sons and daughters of immigrant Jews, or the sons and daughters of immigrant Jews?
It's the jazz singer all over again. It don't mean a thing if it ain't got that swing. My father was a very good singer, and he taught himself to sing in different languages. And at the Latin Quarter, they had a very upper class clientele, people from all over the world. So you could sing this. If he had to sing a song in French, he could, or in Portuguese, or in German, or whatever. He knew how to do it, and the same in Spanish. And that's how the Latin music thing started. And my brother was taking piano lessons. Well, he told me I'd have to tell you his story.
We've got his story.
You got his story.
So you started on the piano.
I started on the piano, but by the time I was in junior high school, I was playing saxophone.
And were you playing in bands?
Well, you mean like high school bands? Yeah, high school bands and marching bands. And then we had a little band in the neighborhood. As a matter of fact, the first paying job I ever had, I think I got paid like $2. We played at the HES in Brooklyn, which is the Hebrew Educational Society. It was like a neighborhood center for all the Jewish people there. It was a senior center, and I even once went one summer to HES camp. All of the underprivileged kids, well, not underprivileged, but whatever. They sent you away for 2 weeks upstate New York to the Jewish camp and kosher food.
And what kind of music were you playing in the band, not in the little band you were in?
We were just playing like show tunes and dance music, and some horrors and some Jewish music too. It was funny. There was a guy who had a music school in Brooklyn, and besides giving music lessons, he taught you how to play in a band. Because it's one thing to sit home and play and just play your instrument, but then they got us together, and we had a piano player and a guitar player and a sax player and a drummer. And they said, well, you play this 2 choruses of this song, and then you go into that song, and how to be a musician, in other words. Then the next set, you play something a little slower, and then you play a Spanish, a rumba. And that's how we learned. And he actually got us our first job in the Catskills.
And how old were you?
About 15.
So could you describe, for a lot of people of our generation and younger who weren't around to go to those...
Well, they had these upstate New York in the Catskills, which was like an hour and a half, 2 hours from New York. They had all these little Jewish hotels. Some were big hotels, but they had small ones also. And they were kosher style. A lot of elderly people. And, this was the first job we played was a real small hotel. Maybe it had like 100, 150 people. And we got paid like $20 a week. The people were like real old, so we would just play for an hour or two at night. And then maybe on Saturday night, they'd have a show, and we'd have to play for the show also. So that's the first, you had to know how to read music and to back up, bring an artist on stage and off stage, and we play stuff on cue, and it was quite an education.
And the music you were playing was predominantly what?
George Gershwin, Broadway show tunes, Cole Porter, and Yiddish melodies.
And so Latin music hadn't crept into the Catskills yet?
Well, Besame Mucho and Miami Beach Rumba. was about as far as that went.
Thanks to Irving Fields.
Irving Fields, Irving Fields took my father's job at the Latin Quarter. Did you know that? Larry mentioned that.
The Harlows have that story down.
Yeah, that is true. Irving Fields, Miami Beach woman, who's still alive.
Yep.
I've actually never met him.
He's around.
He lives here in Florida. So. No?
York.
In Irving Fields. And his little pencil mustache.
And so when did Latin music really start to take off in the Catskills?
When the cha-cha-cha became big in the mid-50s. And then in the bigger hotels, all the big hotels had a Latin band. Besides the show band, they had a Latin band, and that's Machito worked at the Concord every summer, and Joe Cuba worked at the Pines Hotel, and all the hotels had dance instructors, and they'd give the free mambo lesson by the pool, and that kind of stuff. And so by the time I was 16 or 17, I had my own little Latin band in a hotel in the Catskills.
And who were the other guys in the band?
Mainly other Jewish guys. And then it progressed as we got more intense into the Latin, combined Jewish and Latin guys. And
well, for you personally, what was the attraction of Latin music? Because obviously you stuck with it.
Well, I liked it. I liked playing it, and I sort of was able to play it pretty good. I grasped, especially the Latin flute part, and I studied it, and I liked it. And well, my brother was a big influence on me too, but he got me into it also. So.
And so you had this. So the
But I was always a rock and roller too. It was like you two worlds. I did a lot of rock and roll gigs in my teens as well, and was on the road with rock bands, and did the tours of Holiday Inns and lounges and all that stuff too. Mm-hmm. And I wound up, well, that was later on, because I was in my 20s when I went to Woodstock. But the hippie days didn't pass me by.
So, I mean, was that playing Latin bands, being able to play Yiddish melodies, going to Woodstock, that's a pretty big mix of stuff for a Jewish kid from Brooklyn. Was that pretty typical, though, of what it meant to be for you, do you think? To be an American Jew at the time?
To be a musician at that time, you had to know how to play all that stuff. Because when you went to work, you never know, what you had to play. So if you weren't versatile, you didn't work. I might do Friday night like a little Latin gig, and Saturday night at a jazz lounge, and Sunday a bar mitzvah. And that's how you made your living. And I did make a living at it. By the time I was 18, I had my own apartment, my own car. I never had a day gig until I got married and had kids.
But you continued with schooling, right? You continued to study music?
I sure did. Well, on and off. I went for a couple of years after high school, then I dropped out, then I went back in 1967. I was 22. I went back and got a bachelor's degree, and then got a master's
in
music education. And I taught school not very long. I taught in Long Island for 1 year, and I substitute taught in New York for a couple of years. And then when I moved down here, I was looking for a job as a teacher, but wound up going into another field, becoming a social worker.
So what was your first, after the smaller bands you were playing with and the Latin band and the Catskills, what was the kind of the first big gig for you that kind of started your official music career?
Well, there were two. First, in 1967, before I went back to college, Larry was already, my brother was already had his band and had recorded. And I decided to start my own band. And I did for a while. I had a sextet, and Ishmael Miranda, who became Larry's singer later on, and Mark Diamond, who we were just talking about. He was my piano player, and we tried to get the band off the ground, and we were fairly successful, although we never recorded. Then finally, I went back to college, And then, as I wrote, and I told this story, I wrote it on the liner notes on the reissue of my first album. Not that it was handed to me on the silver platter, but I was sort of lucky that I was up at Fania Records one day with Larry, and Jerry Masucci, who was the owner of Fania Records, just said, "Hey, the Harlow name is hot. Why don't we record your brother?" So we go in the studio and I do a ghost album. Basically, it was Larry's band with a different singer and me. And the next thing I know, I got a #1 hit record.
What was the name of the album?
The album was called Sorpresa la Flauta, and the hit record was called La Loteria. That was in 1972. So then,
What did Larry think of that?
he was pretty happy. There was no jealousy or nothing about it. And then he hooked me up with his manager, agent. And the next thing I know, they're calling for me all over the world to do gigs, and I have to put a band together, to go out on the road and do gigs. And luckily, through my experience of being a musician, I was able to deal with that. Because it's not easy being a band leader and putting a band together and running a band and traveling. There's more to it than just picking up the horn and playing. And I can thank my father for that too. My father always knew how to run his band, and he knew about the business side of the music business real good. And sometimes I think a little more of it rubbed off on me than on my brother. But
And so what was the year of that first record you mentioned?
72.
72. So by 1972, you're not just playing with a bunch of your fellow Jewish pals.
No,
You're
1972.
playing with
I'm
heavy
already
hitters.
making $2,000 a night for myself. And at the same time, I got a wife and a baby. Not that I made that money all the time, but the potential was there, and you had to take a lot of lousy paying gigs just to keep the band together too. Keeping a band of 10 Puerto Rican guys together is not an easy task, financially, and all the things that go along with it.
Like what?
In those days, nobody had a car but me. There were no cell phones. There was no, internet. Every time you had to go find a guy, I had to drive to Spanish Harlem and knock on his door.
What was it like for them to be in a band that was led by a Jewish guy?
I never had a problem with that, because the guys knew I was straight ahead and that the money was good and that I knew what I was doing. I never had a problem with that. No, I'm not going to say that. When I moved to Florida, I ran into a little resistance, but that was a whole different thing. That was like a little different thing, but that chilled out too.
And so that first record was for Fania. And this was pretty much at the moment that Fania was starting to become...
Yeah. I had the biggest 45 Fania ever had. 100,000 singles we sold. And then, I don't know, about $40,000 or $50,000, which was humongous in those days, And just by luck, it was a stupid record, La Loteria, the lottery, and the New York had just gotten the lottery for the first time, and it was just one of those things. It just took off,
And so then what happened after that? After that record, did you sign
Well, I
a
did
contract with Fania?
Oh yeah, I did 3 more albums. Okay. Nothing ever compared to the first album, but all 4 recordings came out great. And as musically they progressed, the second, third, and fourth I actually did with my own band, and I had more control over it. The first one was basically Larry, with my name on it. But
So could you walk us through the second, third, and fourth records just by title and
the second one was La Música Brava, which was basically the band, my band, with the 2 trombones and flute. Then the third one, because also in those days, things were real good at Fania and the budgets were improving, I was able to use like big horn sections, string sections, synthesizers by then. I had Elliot Randall from Steely Dan on guitar. Things improved, the budgets improved, and the recordings improved. And then I did the fourth one, was even a bigger band. And they all the 4 albums stand on their own. I like them all. And then after that, I moved to Florida and got out of my contract with Fania. Because I was here in Florida, I thought I was going to do my own thing here. And
the names of the third record and the fourth record?
El Campesino was the third, and the fourth was Latin Fever.
And Latin Fever did pretty well for you. I mean, that's
They
a
all
very
did pretty
well-known-
well. Not that they didn't sell badly. They all did pretty well, but nothing like La Loteria, which was a smash. You know, which still gets lots of airplay today, 35 years later. So.
And was there at any point when you were making those records, basically recording as a Latin recording artist, that were there any kind of identity crisis moments, like, what is a Jewish kid like me doing this music, or did it feel completely natural?
No, it felt pretty good. And even on the latter two, we did a couple of, it was the 70s already, so a couple of disco tunes, you know. But no, that never. And then on some of them also a couple of Latin jazz tracks. I was always into, you know, my ear-wise leaning towards the Latin jazz side of Latin music. So.
And who was buying these records, do you think?
Well, it was New York, Puerto Rico mainly, and then Latin America, and, you know, and South America.
So was your sense that there were also a lot of Jews buying these records, or was that kind of like an earlier Mambo moment when Jews were buying Mambo records, or do you think there were a lot of Jewish fans of Fania?
There was some, but that wasn't their main audience, and they never tried to sell stuff to that audience. Not like Seco Records did, you know, with Joe Cuba and La Playa Sextet. That was 10 years earlier.
And so could you tell us about Seco, so that, in your opinion, they were trying to market more toward a Jewish audience?
Well, that's when Mambo broke and Cha-Cha broke in the 50s, that's who was buying the records. You know, Randy Carlos and Smoke and Joe Cuba Sextet and La Playa Coco Seco. Because those are the bands that played in the Catskills. And those, it was funny because at the Palladium, Sunday night was like Jewish night. You know? And those were the bands that would put in the Palladium on Sunday night. Now, and Tito Puente Machito too, of course, but and Tito Rodriguez, but then as the point, it's funny because I'm in the middle of producing this 5-part radio series called Salsa America, and one of the shows deals with that topic of New York in the 50s, and as more Puerto Ricans started immigrating to New York, and by the early 60s, it was like 1.5 million Puerto Ricans in New York, that the record companies saw, and then New York also started having Spanish radio stations by the early 60s. So the whole record business changed too.
What do you think?
The Latin record business changed.
What do you think was the appeal of Latin music to American Jews?
Oh, wow. I don't know if it was the role with that because that was the new in thing to learn to dance the cha-cha. A lot of Jews were going up and back to Cuba in the late 40s, early 50s, and maybe it was just like any other craze. I don't really know.
But was it a craze that Jewish people were more into than like Irish Catholics or?
Yeah, it was. Why
was that, do you think?
I don't know. I really don't. Jews in general are not great dancers. You know, at least for that ballroom dance and stuff. You know, it's one thing to make a circle with.
But dance they did.
But dance they did. That's right. What's that joke? Will lead to dancing. There's a joke about the guy goes to the rabbi. You know the joke. I only remember the punchline. No, you can't do that. It leads to dancing.
It's about mixed dancing.
Yeah, something about it. Mixed dancing. Yeah. Something like that.
So what was it like as an artist under contract with Fania, which is obviously a legendary record label? What are your memories of it?
I was like a second-tier artist. I was like, you know, I wasn't on the starting team. And I got passed by like for the Fania All-Stars and a couple other things. You know, it didn't really bother me. But how it worked there was, you know, you always needed money in those days. So every time you went to Masucci for money, you have to have like a, you know, some kind of excuse or rap or this or that. So when Loteria was ahead, right away he wanted to extend my contract, you know, to protect his investment. So they threw you some money. Well, we're going to extend your contract 2 more years. And this and that. It was okay in certain ways. I got, got to play on a lot of recording dates and stuff like that as a sign man. And but more so, it was my manager, Jose Cabello, who built me as an attraction, as an artist, performing-wise, gig-wise. He was the one who actually got the gigs. And in New York it was so strange. Like here I am opening for Dizzy Gillespie on the Jazzmobile. It's incredible, and stuff like that, and because Cabello was Larry's manager, Tito Puente's manager, Eddie Palmieri, and a whole bunch of others. So he had a lot of pull. So when people would call for Tito Puente, he would say, well, they're having like whatever kind of affair was party, some kind of banquet or something or whatever, or a nightclub. Oh, you want Tito Puente? Well, you got to take Andy Harlow too, as the opening act, And Tito was always helped me so much, man, because I was kind of nervous. I remember the first TV interview I had to do for Manhattan Cable. You remember Manhattan? That was the forerunner to HBO. And it was me and Tito. I'd never done a TV interview. He just like took me aside and said, "Don't worry about it. Just follow me," and blah blah blah. And he was cool.
So, what was he like, Tito?
When it came to that stuff, he was real cool. You know what I mean? When it came to like playing in his band, that was a different story. But
what was that like?
Well, he could be tough at times. He was, a perfectionist at times. And yet, on the other hand, business-wise, he wasn't that great. You know what I mean? That's what the guys in the band used to tell me. But
in what way?
Well, Tito was... All right, I know they're going to kill me for this, but I'm going to say that lots of times, at the end of the night, the IRS guy was always show up when Tito went to get paid because he owed the government a lot of money, and he was, he wasn't a great businessman.
They were his greatest fans, the IRS.
Yeah, the IRS. It was like a Willie Nelson syndrome.
They never missed a gig.
You know what I mean? Yeah, right. They never missed a gig. Exactly. But that's kind of commonplace in the music business. But the exact opposite of Tito Rodriguez, who was all business. And Tito would fire guys if their shoes weren't shined, or if they were 2 minutes late. Just different personalities.
And so, with your experience with Fania, would you say was a positive one? For you were under contract for 4 records.
Yeah. Okay. It was my own choosing to break the contract. I thought that was the best thing to do at the time. In retrospect, maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. I don't know. I was, like I said, I was always Larry's brother, sometimes. But when you heard the records, my records are as good as anybody's, or better. No, seriously, and way ahead of their times, a lot of them. Maybe that's why they didn't sell. But it was cool.
And where were you touring when you were kind of working those 4 records?
Well, we would do runouts on the East Coast. Mainly, that was most of the jobs like that. And that's where you made your money, outside of New York City. If you had Saturday night in Boston or in Hartford, Connecticut, or in Newark, New Jersey, or Philadelphia, your price doubled or tripled. So in those days, you had a 10-piece band, so you pile everybody into a car and a van and drive to Philly. Because in the clubs in New York, there was a lot of bands working cheap. But outside of New York, you were an attraction. You were the Beatles. That's how. It amazes me that even recently, when I went to Mexico with Larry a few months ago, they treated us like we were the Rolling Stones or something. It was incredible. People running up with all the old album covers from the 70s and screaming out the titles of songs I haven't played in 30 years and asking me questions. Well, who was the bongo player when you recorded this, and who was the first trumpet player? And I couldn't even remember half that stuff. it's amazing how it's become a worldwide thing now.
So you mentioned opening for Dizzy. Could you maybe list off some other folks you played with and shared the stage with?
Well, in the Latin scene, everybody from Tito Puente to Celia Cruz to Machito to the Fania also, Ray Barreto, Johnny Pacheco, because we all played the same clubs. I opened for Cal Jada once too, and that's when even earlier when I was about 19 years old. I remember that, and he actually it was at the La Mancha on 14th Street in Manhattan, and it was 2 flights up without an elevator, and I was working steady there every weekend, so my vibes were already there. I played vibraphones too. So when Cal Jada showed up, he didn't want to schlep his vibes up the stairs, so he did the gig on my vibes. So then I'm standing in the wings, with my mouth open, watching this. He was a legend even then, and he sort of looks at me and he motions to me like if I want to come out and jam with him, but I punked out.
Of all the people you opened for in those years, would you say you had a favorite who was the most fun to open for and maybe the nicest to work with, and then the opposite, if there was someone who was the biggest pain?
Well, in those days, you really didn't open for anybody unless it was a concert. See, I opened for Dizzy Gillespie because it was on the Jazzmobile. I don't know if you know what that is. It was this flatbed truck that ran around, that they took to different neighborhoods in the summertime and just brought jazz right to like 106th Street and Park Avenue. We just parked the truck on the corner, and so and stuff like that. But like in the clubs, everything had to do with schedule. Sometimes I would open, sometimes other bands would go on first because I was coming from another gig. Or, More important was like billing.
Right.
Who got top billing? That was the that was the manager's main concern. Who got the top billing?
And with all of these major Latin artists that you played with, knew, from Celia to Ishmael to everybody, did you ever get any static from any of them about being a kind of outsider in Latin music?
No, not at all, because Larry paved the way, so there was no problem with that. It was sort of a novelty, I guess, in a way also. And there was a time there, like when they would confuse Larry and I. People would thought that he did La Loteria and I did La Cantera and stuff like that. But
so could you tell us about Latin Fever, just as a concept record, what that was for you?
You've heard it?
Yeah.
Well, I had a couple of charanga tunes. There was a disco tune. There was a couple of Latin jazz influence type tunes. And a couple of typical Cuban. It was a big budget thing, and I went wild. I had the whole Saturday Night Live band on there, the Brecker Brothers, and Bones Malone, and Lou Marini, and what's his name, Lou Soloff from Blood, Sweat, and Tears, and it was a lot of fun. It was a lot of fun. And in those days, the money was no problem. So I said, might as well. Why not? And use the best arrangers. And
how long did it take you to record that record?
The usual. It didn't take that long. We laid the tracks down in 2 sessions and did the overdubs. And didn't take that long.
And you recorded it
at the Good Vibrations, at the Fania studios, the old RKO studios.
How are we on tape?
How are we on tape?
20 minutes left.
Oh, 20.
What was Miami like in the 1970s? Can you describe the scene?
And why'd you move?
Okay.
Why'd you move?
Okay. First I come down here when La Loteria was a hit. I was still living in New York, and we come down here with my band. They flew us down for one night to do a gig. And the gig was not far from here, what they call St. Sophia's Greek Church. And this had knocked me, it blew my mind because the first time I ever saw this, the teenage girls had chaperones. Very, upper class Cuban type. Because in New York, 16-year-old girls stayed up till 4 in the morning by themselves, you know. So that was my first taste of Miami. Then I go back to New York. About 2 years later, I come down to play a club on Miami Beach with a sextet. The club was called the Numero Uno. And I had a 6-week contract. We worked there 5 nights a week for 6 weeks. And they put us up in a hotel. And that's when I said, I can make some money here. I like this here. This is nice. There were a lot of Latin clubs. You know what I mean? And things to do. And in New York, by the mid-'70s, salsa was sort of like dying off a little bit. So I came to the Numero for 6 weeks in the summer. Then I came back for 6 weeks for Christmas and New Year's. Christmas 1976 and New Year's Eve. And that's when I decided to stay. So a couple of the guys in the band stayed with me. The other guys went back. And by that time, I had a 2-year-old son, and my wife was pregnant with another child. So I said, well, let me give it a shot here. I wasn't exactly... in New York, I was substitute teaching and stuff just to make ends meet. So I had some family here too, my uncles and cousins. So I moved down here, and I went to work right away. I got a job right away, not as a band leader, but as playing the saxophone with another band at a hotel. And within 4 or 5 months, I started meeting everybody, all the Latin guys here. One of the first guys I met was Cachao and Paquito Echevarria, and everybody accepted me here. And before you know it, I'm playing with everybody here. And then I met this guy named Louis Serrano, who was a bass player, and him and I became partners. And we went into we were the first Latin club date band here. I took what I saw in New York about playing weddings and bar mitzvahs and adapted it here. And also, let me back up a little bit. I was making money here playing the saxophone. I was playing like Jewish weddings and bar mitzvahs and club dates. And all these companies were run by these Jewish guys from New York who had moved down here. They brought that whole Jewish bar mitzvah shtick down here. But it was a funny thing, though. They didn't know how to do Latin jobs. Their Latin repertoire was very limited. And these people, like I was telling you before, wanted authentic Cuban music and Puerto Rican music. So one guy took me into his company, and I brought Louis in there, and we learned the business from them. And 2 years later, we opened our own office. And in the 80s and 90s, Miami was swinging, and we were doing a lot of convention work and hotel work and corporate parties. And I played the wedding for Jose Canseco, the baseball player, and other big names, and stuff like that. It was funny because our main competition then was a band called Miami Sound Machine. They were a wedding band too at that time, and they went on to, whatever they went on to, but and that's how it was. They started out playing Cuban Jewish parties, Emilio and Gloria.
So could you tell us a little bit about the diversity of those different audiences? I mean, there were Jews from New York in Miami. There were Cuban Jews. There are Sephardic Cubans.
Right, and then you had
So if you could list them off for us, who are all these different groups?
Okay, like you said, you had the New York Jews, the condo crowd, right, and then you had the Ashkenazi Cuban Jews and the Sephardic Cuban Jews, and then you had some other.
Did they mix?
Yeah, but they had their own separate temples, and yet, because a lot of them intermarried and stuff too, And all the kids went to the Hebrew Academy and the private Jewish schools on the beach. And they were sort of tight-knit communities, to both of them. And I used to do a lot of parties for them at both temples, at the Cuban Hebrew and Temple Moses, which was the Sephardic temple. And where was it? They had a lot of, and then there was also like Panamanian Jews and Mexican Jews, and then you had this also, an American Jew marrying a Cuban. So you needed a band that could play American music and Latin music. So we did that's what we geared into. And after we learned the business end of the business from those New York guys, we opened our own office and we did pretty good until the music business started changing, like in the early '90s, when it became more DJs and the wedding business and more DJs and sequences and stuff like that.
So when you were playing the Ashkenazic Cuban weddings and the Sephardic Cuban weddings, could you maybe walk us through, if you can remember, like kind of what you were playing, like your set list? Was it the same set list, or did it change for those weddings?
Well, we would play the contemporary music, the Sinatra, Stevie Wonder, Billy Joel type stuff, that you hear at a wedding. Then there was all the horrors that you had to play, and then some of them wanted the Mazinka and different other traditional kind of Jewish stuff that you would play for, like when the last child gets married and this and that, and then we had to start learning more of like the Israeli stuff and the Sephardic stuff for those people. Mm-hmm. And the Middle Easterns. Sometimes they would even bring their own Middle Eastern bands, like bouzouki players and the real Middle Eastern ones.
And who was in your band at that time? Who was playing with you?
It was mainly Cuban guys, Latin guys and Cuban guys. And maybe the guitar player was American.
Well, was it weird for them, do you think, to be playing all those Jewish weddings?
No, we got used to it. It was after a while, it just became routine to us that you would play. You introduce the bride and groom, play the horrors, and then right after the horrors, go into Caballo Viejo and the congas and everything else. It was just like routine, commonplace.
And so this was late 70s, early 80s?
Early 80s, mid 80s. Into the 90s.
Was there a moment for you when, you were in New York, had a recording contract, put out 4 records, now you're in Miami, killing it on the wedding circuit? Was there a moment where you thought, oh, I'd like to put out more Fania records and go back to New York in that scene?
No, I did 2 albums here, one on my own label and one for Cubane Records, and no, not really. I made more money here. It's funny. I made more money in the music business here than I did in New York on a consistent basis. It was different kind of work, you're doing 2-3 weddings on a weekend, and plus all week. During the week there was selling involved. It was a very high cutthroat, high pressure business, a lot of competition. And this was before the internet and YouTube and all that stuff. So we had an office with a TV, and we would video the band, and people would come in and we would show them videos of the band, and you know what I mean? It was a whole, it's a whole high pressure selling thing. After a while I got burned out with it and packed it in already, but that's how it was. And that's because those guys from New York brought that with them. That's just how the business was. There's a lot of competition. And people, somebody's, because we're charging in those days $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 for a wedding band, So, and then, you know how Jewish mothers and fathers are for their daughter's wedding. They only, very particular, and they all want the best, and very demanding, So they're high pressure jobs, If everything has to be exact, or you make one mistake, or you make one bad announcement, you were doomed, boy. Not just for that wedding, for all their cousins and family and everybody else.
And were you playing Latin gigs, straight up Latin gigs at the same time?
Yeah, but at the same time we would do 100% Cuban weddings, and then during the week we would work Cuban clubs, and corporate work and convention work. In those days there was a lot of that, bank parties and business parties and Christmas parties and that kind of stuff.
And what were the big Cuban clubs? You remember some of the names?
Oh yeah, there's still the Big Five. You mean nightclubs?
Mm-hmm.
Well, all along right here, Coral Way, right along here, there was a million clubs, and then on 8th Street there were a million clubs. The Montmartre, the Casablanca, Papa Grandes, the International. There were, you know.
Did you ever come across a club called El Avram?
Sounds familiar. Was that an Israeli club?
It was only open for a very short time, maybe about a year at most.
I remember the name.
It was in New York originally.
But the whole club scene, then what happened here with the clubs was when all those, in 1980, when all those Cuban musicians came from Mariel, they started working cheap. So the nightclub scene went right, that was the end of that. You know, except for if you got lucky. But we used to work like every Sunday night at the Mutiny Hotel here in Coconut Grove. Sunday night was like drug dealer night. You know, all these guys with big bottles of Remy Martin and Dom Perignon and, you know, Colombian drug dealers. And the money flowed. That was another thing about the 80s here. There was a lot of cash around.
Was it a good time?
It was a good time, yeah.
Can you tell us a good story?
Well, we used to have this one customer who loved mariachis. And we would send like 10, 15 mariachis at a time out to his house. You know, and he would keep them there for hours and just pay with stacks of $20 bills. And, you know, it was good. You know.
Was there much trouble?
Yet at the same time, this is funny though. At the same time, if somebody, I would go to South Beach and play with two old Jewish guys on a Monday night, like at the Kosher Crown Hotel, right? And they'd have like an 80-year-old comedian and a singer. It was like I was back in the Catskills. You know, I'd go from one to the other, like from one day to the other would be, you know.
And were those audiences pretty segregated? That were there Jews in the audience at any of the Latin nights? The Latin clubs you were talking about, or was that
the Latin clubs here were mainly Latin. You would get a few gringos come in, but there were some clubs up like on the beach that were mixed, where the Jews would go dancing. The Numero Uno, the place where I first came here to play in, was a mixed club, because it was on Miami Beach. It would get the old time Palladium crowd and the Miami Latin crowd. And that's why they would bring in like people, Joe Cuba, and people who had New York names as well. Harlow played there, and then myself, I played there twice. And yet at the same time, when I played at the Numero Uno, in the main room, in the lounge, was Willie Chirino with a trio. You know, this was 1977, you know.
And so the records you recorded in Miami, could you walk us through those? What their titles were and what year?
Well, first, Louis Serrano and I did an album for Cubané. It was a funny story. It was just the owner of Cubané Records, Mateo San Martin, flew us to Dallas, Texas to play his niece's wedding, because there were no Cuban bands in Dallas, Texas. And we went out there with just like a 5 or 6 piece band. And he was so impressed by how we played a wedding that he said, I want you to go into the studio and just play what you played at the wedding. Everything from New York to Havana Nagila to Cuban cha-chas and mambos. And the album was called something like Having a Party with Louis Serrano and Andy Harlow. It was kind of a strange concept album, but right? And then the other album I did was I produced myself with Larry. I brought you a copy of it, as a matter of fact. Did Larry ever give you a copy? Now it's called Miami Sessions. And those, you know, it was called Miami Sessions then too, but we got a new cover. And we recorded it here, me, Larry, and Mark Diamond, Eddie Guagua, a bunch of guys, Miami guys. That was 1985.
That's not the last record you've done. You've done records since.
That's the last one I did, yeah.
And so, what started? And you're still playing now?
Occasionally. No, I'll play with Larry's band with the Latin Legends sometimes. I went to Mexico with him, and I went to all over the Caribbean with him, and sometimes in Texas, and a whole bunch of places. We went to Fort, what was that place? In North Carolina, some Army base. And I went to New York and played with Larry, and we did the big concert in Puerto Rico. And I play here with, sometimes I can get gigs with my own band. I still freelance around as a sax player. Now that I'm retired, I can pick and choose.
What's your sense of how Latin music has changed since the days that you got involved with it? What are some of the big changes in it?
Well, as far as like the bands?
Yeah, or just kind of the state of Latin music, because it's a whole different world now than...
Well, now it's reggaeton, and all these big bands that come from Colombia, and from here, and from there, and I don't know. And they're playing the same old music, except for that merengue stuff. We never played merengue, but it's different now. They don't, you know. Now it's, I don't know how to say this. It's been homogenized. You know, everybody, all they want to play is like this. They pablamize it. Nobody knows what the music sounds like. It's just a mishmash of everything. It's not Cuban, it's not Puerto Rican, it's not Colombian, it's not authentic anything. It's just whatever it is. And people dance to it, and it's geared for mental midgets or something. You know what I mean? Like those new merengues. But that's what people like. But there are still some people around who respect and understand the music, you know, and respect it as an art form, and hopefully it'll remain that way. Now, at least, like at least down here, they give courses in Cuban music and the history of salsa and Latin jazz.
And when did you start doing a radio show?
I've been involved with the radio station here on and off since the 1980s. And then in the 90s, and I had an internet radio show. I was on lamusica.com. Mm-hmm. And then when they got sold, I left there, and I came back here. Then I also do a radio show off my website.
And what do you play on the shows?
Salsa and Latin jazz. But now I host 2 live shows a week here, and I'm also producing, like I said, those the History of Salsa show, Salsa America. That's going to air during Hispanic Heritage Week. And hopefully it's going to be syndicated on PRI. So we'll see what happens with that.
And you mentioned in passing a little bit ago that your day job was as a social worker. And that was here in Miami?
Yeah.
For how many years?
Almost 30 years I worked there. I started out even in New York, I was a music therapist. Even though my degree was in music education, I got a job right before I left New York as a music therapist. And that got me a job down here as a music therapist. And that sort of like, somehow or another, led me into a job as a social worker. I was working in a private hospital as a music therapist, a residential treatment center. And then I went to work for the government as a social worker.
And was that a big kind of identity split for you? Social worker by day, king of weddings and Latin jazz?
Yeah, it was Andy Harlow and Andre Cohen.
Oh, so as a social worker, you didn't have your performing name?
No, but it was actually kind of cool because you know when you work for the government, it was if I had a gig out of town, I could take off. If I worked late one night, I could come. You know, it was cool as far as better than being a teacher. One thing I didn't like about being a teacher was that you're back in school. You had period 1, period 2, go to lunch from 12:40 to 1:08. You know.
Was the Andre Kahn, Andy Harlow name split something you did your whole life, or was that just a Miami?
No, I went to college under Andre Kahn, but from my very first music gig, I was Andy Harlow because my father was Buddy Harlow, and my brother was Larry Harlow. You know, and my uncle was Joe Harlow. So.
What do your family call you?
Say that again.
What do your family call you?
I don't understand.
Yeah, what'd your family call you? Andy.
Even though my birth name was Andre. You know, growing up in Brooklyn, Andre was tough having the name Andre, you know. You get a lot of flack in school, you know. You know what happened in Brownsville, Brooklyn, but
But your family knows you as Andy Harlow or as Andy Kahn?
Which film? Which?
When you were growing up, your parents and everyone.
No, it was Andy Kahn until I played that first gig. You know. You know. I even remember buying those stick-on letters and putting it on my saxophone case. You know.
And that name change for you was not about leaving behind Jewishness or anything like that?
No, not at all. No. It was the name my father used, and the story goes, I don't know if Larry told you the story how my father got the name. That was Dr. Harlow who saved his life. So he took the name Buddy Harlow.
I wanted to ask you just two follow-up things about the Miami days. One, can you tell us about the Calle Ocho song?
Okay. Let me back. You know, when I first got here in the 70s, South Beach was still all old Jewish people sitting on the porches and the rocking chairs. You know what I mean? And kosher restaurants. All that is gone. All those the people died off, and the children or whatever. All the Jews have moved to Boca Raton.
And who's taking their place?
Gentiles. You know, that whole South Beach became, you know, what it is, you know. Okay, I forget when it was, 1984. Okay, it was around 1984. And I was still working for the American company, Musically Yours. And I had played the very first Calle Ocho. And we got paid through the musicians union. It was like one of those trust fund jobs. And the very first Calle Ocho, we just played on a flatbed truck in a gas station. And it was about 10 blocks long. They had different bands, and it started to grow. By around 1986 or 87, it was really taking off. And I gave the idea of the song to this Puerto Rican guy. I can't think of his name now, but I wrote the lyrics in English and he put them in Spanish. It was basically the idea for the song was my idea, but he actually did the Spanish lyrics. Fernando Resto was his name, and those guys at the company I was working with, they put up the money and we went into the studio and recorded that one song. And we sold it to the Calle Ocho Festival as their theme song. And they ordered like 5,000 45s. And they got them in these, because they were giving everybody these little gift bags and stuff. And it got some airplay, it got a lot of airplay, and it sort of became like a local hit. And that was it. It's on the CD I'm giving you.
Cool.
And that's how Calle, and the story's about that it was this rundown street, nothing was happening there until the Cubans came, and they opened the stores and the factories and the blah, 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 blah. And it was kind of a nostalgic Cuban song about how great the Cubans made Miami and so forth and so on.
Is that a story you still stick to?
It's kind of true. It's kind of true. Yeah, this town would be a ghost town without them. Now there are other ethnic groups here that have, you know, replaced them. And they've moved on to bigger and better things. Calle Ocho which was the heart of the little Havana of the Cuban neighborhood, is now all Central American now. But,
and then in 1988, who were the Salsa Brothers?
That's me and Larry. That was what we called the album, Salsa Brothers.
And what songs were you doing on that record?
We did Calle Ocho and a bunch of originals. The rest were all original stuff. And actually, that was one of the first recordings of Luis Enrique singing. And he was unknown then. He played the conga drums and sang lead on a couple of songs. It was done without horns. We used electric keyboards, synthesizers, and vibes and sax. And it was sort of like I was trying to like duplicate Ruben Blades and Seis Solar, that type of sound. Whether we accomplish it or not, I don't know. That was the idea.
When you were here, when you moved down to Miami, was Belle Barth still here at the Collins Hotel? Do you know Belle Barth?
I knew her from the Catskills. No, she was Pearl Williams, I think, was here, and Woody Woodbury. He was, but Jackie Mason was doing a show here.
Had you ever seen Pearl or Belle in concert?
Oh yeah, the Catskills.
What was it like?
They were hilarious, but the best was B.S. Pulley. Do you know about him?
Mm-hmm.
He was one of the funniest guys I've ever seen. And by the time Jackie Mason, he at one time had like his own club here and was doing shows, but I had seen him in the Catskills a million times and sat behind him. One of the things about working in the Catskills, you have to sit on stage here behind all those comedians forever, and some of them were good. I used to like, did you ever hear Malzy Lawrence?
Mm-hmm.
Malzy was great. He's still around. And some of those old Catskill comedians made it to Florida, some didn't. And then I remember working at Brown's Hotel. I was the leader of the Latin band in the Catskills. The Brown's Hotel was famous for, that's where Jerry Lewis got his start. And he would come up like a July 4th and Labor Day and do shows. And his father was a seasoned guest there, Danny Lewis. His father was a big pain in the ass. Push his weight around, but he was okay.
So
And then I was in Lenny. I was working at Brown's Hotel when they were filming the movie Lenny. So I was just an extra, but
still, it's good credit.
yeah. I was in the in the nightclub scenes, just sitting around the table. But
So you've just mapped out for us this pretty remarkable career that's taken you from Brooklyn to here. When you look back on it all, are there things that you think that you've got, that there are regrets that you have or decisions that maybe you...
We were just talking about that before we even started when I was telling you about USC. You don't know, you never know what's, coulda, shoulda, woulda, if I would have done this, if I would have done that. If I would have came to Miami earlier, if I would have stayed in New York. I have really no regrets. I've accomplished a lot in my own little way. First of all, just knowing and playing and being there when all this stuff was happening, when history was made, it was incredible. I was there when they filmed the Fania All-Stars at the Cheetah, and I was there at Woodstock, and I saw Miles Davis at the Village Vanguard when I was 16 years old. That stuff stays with you forever.
What are you most proud of all the things you've done?
I'm most proud of my 4 albums. And I'm proud of, my kids and the life I've led and this and that. No real regrets, What can you say, Sure, back in the days when I blew all that money and all that stuff, everybody says, if I knew now what I knew then, and I got ripped off by all the record companies and by all the nightclub owners, but that's showbiz. Everybody went through that, But I got tons of memories and stories and laughs and. Well, my name is Andy Harlow, and that's most of my story. What can I say? What this has to do with, I'm a somewhat famous Jewish musician, and but music has been with me all since I'm a kid, and I guess it'll just stay with me, and it's just as my Jewishness will stay with me. Right?
Cool.